Tonight we turn toward water, the way it moves, the way it yields, and the way it shapes mountains without ever raising its voice. Lao Tzu believed water was the closest thing in nature to true strength, not the strength of force, but the strength of patience. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers, scattered across many time zones, finding their way to rest together tonight. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. These teachings are for anyone who has ever felt rigid, braced, unable to bend, and wondered if there was a gentler way to carry the weight of a day, a week, or a long, tiring season of life. So wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day brought you here, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Across these 13 chapters, we will walk beside rivers, sit at the edge of still ponds, watch ice loosen its grip on a frozen branch, follow a single drop of rain into the sea, and listen for what each of these waters has always been trying to teach us. Each chapter holds its own small story, its own quiet image, drawn from a different people and a different shore. Together they trace one long, slow teaching. That softness is not weakness, and yielding is not defeat. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Wherever this evening finds you, let us begin. There is an old book called the Tao Du Jing. Known in the West as the Tao Te Ching, it was written, tradition says, by a sage named Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu. In it, he returns again and again to a single image: water. Water does not fight. It settles into the lowest places, the places others avoid, and from there it quietly sustains everything around it. It nourishes the rice field, the tree root, the open mouth, asking for no credit. Lao Tzu called this the nature of the highest good, to help without competing, to give without needing to be seen. True strength, he believed, looks far more like water than like stone. Across the many chapters ahead, we will return to this single image again and again, each time from a slightly different angle, the way water itself returns endlessly to the same low places without ever growing tired of arriving there, never once complaining about the journey. In a valley where two rivers met, there lived an old woman known only as the boatwright. She had built boats for 60 years, and travelers came from far villages to learn her craft. Her workshop smelled of cedar shavings and river mud, and curls of pale wood gathered in drifts along the floor wherever she had been working. One spring morning, a young carpenter arrived at her workshop, his boots still damp from the ford he had crossed at dawn. He was strong, his hands calloused from years of cutting timber for houses and bridges. He had built things that did not move, things that stood firm against wind and snow, rafters that held roofs steady through 40 winters. Now he wanted to learn boats. "Teach me to build something unbreakable," he said. I want my boats to survive any storm." The old woman looked at him for a long moment, taking in the calluses, the set of his jaw, the way he stood as if bracing against some wind only he could feel. Then she smiled, the way she always smiled before she spoke, as if amused by something only she could see. "Sit," she said, and gestured to a low stool beside the river, where the current moved past in steady, unhurried folds, catching the morning light in flashes of silver. The carpenter sat. The old woman did not speak right away. She picked up a plank of cedar, ran her thumb along its grain, and set it down again, the way another person might pause to consider their words. Somewhere downstream, a heron lifted off the shallows with a slow beat of grey wings. Then she walked to the riverbank and filled a clay bowl with water from the current. She brought it back and placed it in the carpenter's hands. "Hold this without spilling it," she said, settling the bowl carefully into his open palms, the water trembling faintly at its rim. The carpenter held the bowl carefully, both hands steady, eyes fixed on the surface. He did not move. He thought of every joist he had ever planed true, every beam he had wedged so tightly it would never shift. He brought that same rigid care to the bowl. After a while his arms began to shake from the strain of holding so still, and a fine tremor crept from his wrists into his fingers. "This is foolish," he said, his arms still trembling slightly from the effort. "A bowl is not a boat." "No," the boatwright agreed, "but tell me, what happens to the water if you grip the bowl too tightly, if your hand trembles from trying too hard to be perfectly still?" He looked down. A few drops had already slipped over the rim, shaken loose by his own tension. "It spills," he said. "And what happens if you simply hold it, gently, the way you might hold a sleeping child?" He loosened his grip. His arms stopped shaking. The water settled, undisturbed. "It stays," he said, surprised. "Boats are not built to resist the river," the boatwright said. "They are built to move with it. A boat that fights the current breaks. A boat that yields to the current's shape, that rises and falls with each swell instead of bracing against it, that one survives the storm you fear." The carpenter looked down at the river beside them, watching how it carried a fallen branch without effort, turning it gently end over end. "I have seen boats break apart in storms," he admitted. "I always believed it meant they were not built strong enough. Perhaps I had it backward." "Most builders have it backward," the boatwright said. "They reinforce the hull, thicken the planks, add more nails, believing more rigidity means more safety. And sometimes it does for a season. But the sea does not care how many nails hold a plank in place if the plank itself cannot bend with the wave that strikes it. The wave does not negotiate." She walked him along the riverbank to where an old wreck lay half buried in silt, its ribs exposed like the bones of some great fish. "This boat was built by a man who did not believe me," she said. "He doubled the thickness of every plank, certain that thicker meant stronger. The first real storm it met, it could not flex with the swell. It split down the keel in a single night, while lesser boats beside it, thinner and more supple, rode out the same storm untouched." The carpenter crouched beside the wreck, running a hand over the splintered wood. "It looks strong," he said. Even broken it looks strong. Many broken things look strong right up until the moment they break, the boatwright said. That is precisely what makes rigidity such a convincing illusion. The carpenter frowned. But surely strength matters. Surely a sturdier hull survives better than a flimsy one. Of course, she said, strength matters. But strength is not the same as rigidity. Look at the water in your hands. It has no shape of its own, and yet nothing in this valley is stronger. It carves canyons. It moves boulders twice the size of your workshop. It does this not by resisting, but by yielding completely, again and again, for longer than the stone can hold its form. And what of the rocks downstream? The carpenter asked. The ones that refuse to move at all, are they not strong too? They are strong for a season, she said. Watch them in 20 years. The water will still be here, the same water it always was, only the rocks will have changed shape, worn smooth and small, surrendering a little more of themselves with every flood. The water never loses anything by yielding. It is the stone that slowly disappears. She took the bowl from him gently and poured the water back into the river, where it disappeared into the current without a sound, swallowed instantly among 1,000 others just like it. You have spent your life building things that do not move, she said. Now you must learn to build something that moves with everything around it and breaks for nothing. The carpenter stayed in the valley through that summer. He learned to bend wood with steam instead of forcing it with tools, easing each plank over a fire until it softened enough to curve without splitting. He learned to read the grain of cedar the way the boatwright read the river, not as something to conquer, but as something to listen to, running his palm along each board until he could feel where it wanted to bend and where it would crack if pushed too far. By autumn, he had built his first hull, light and curved, with a shape that seemed to already know how to ride a wave before it ever touched water. The boatwright watched him launch it from the bank, wading in to her knees to steady it against the current. It still wants to fight the river a little, she said, studying the way it sat in the water. Give it a season. It will learn to stop arguing. He never forgot the lesson of the bowl. Years later, when storms came and other boats split against the rocks, splintering under waves that struck them like fists, his held, not because it resisted the sea, but because it had learned, long before, to move the way water moves, rising with each swell instead of meeting it head-on. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding of strength through yielding. The poet Rumi often wrote of the reed flute, cut from the reed bed and hollowed out, made to sing only because it had been emptied. Rumi believed that a heart too full of its own rigid certainty could not make music. Only a heart willing to be hollowed, to yield its fullness, could carry a true note. Sufi teachers also speak of the concept of fana, a kind of dissolving of the small, rigid self into something larger. This is not destruction. It is closer to what happens when a single drop of rain joins a river. It does not disappear. It simply stops insisting on its separateness. The Sufi mystic Hafiz wrote often of wine, water, and the cup, using each as an image for a self that has stopped gripping so tightly to its own shape. He described the seeker's heart as a vessel that must first be emptied before it can be filled with anything true. much the way the carpenter had to loosen his grip before the bowl could rest steady in his hands. Both lessons point toward the same quiet truth that the boatwright offered the carpenter. The reed must be hollow to sing. The drop must yield to the river to become part of the sea. And the boat must bend to ride the wave rather than fight it. In each tradition, what looks like surrender from the outside is, from the inside, simply a different kind of strength, one that does not insist, does not brace, does not need to win. The Sufi seeker, the Taoist sage, and the boatwright's young carpenter all eventually discover the same thing from different shores. That the softest part of themselves was never their weakness at all, but the very place their truest strength had been quietly waiting. You may know this feeling already, the strain of trying to hold something too tightly, the way the carpenter's arms shook over a bowl of water. Think about a time you tried to force an outcome at work, gripping a plan so hard that any small change felt like failure. You may have felt this yourself in a difficult conversation, bracing for an argument that never needed to happen, exhausting yourself before a single hard word was spoken. Or think of a time you tried to control how a loved one felt about a decision you had already made, rehearsing your defense long before they ever raised an objection. This shows up in ordinary life when you resist a delay, a change of plans, a piece of news you did not expect. The grip tightens, the breath shortens, the mind insists that holding on harder will somehow make things hold together. A second example might be noticing how your hands clench the steering wheel during heavy traffic, as though tighter knuckles could move the cars ahead of you any faster. But there is another way, the same way the boatwright showed the carpenter. Not gripping, but holding gently. Not bracing, but moving with what comes. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to hold anything tightly. Let your hands rest, open, the way they might rest around a bowl that no longer needs protecting. Feel, rather than think, what it is like to simply let the water settle. This is the same softness that will carry you gently into sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote that the highest good is like water, because water benefits all things and competes with none. This is the heart of what Taoists call non-contention. The idea that you do not need to push against others to find your own place in the world. Water never argues with the riverbank. It never insists that the rocks move first. It simply finds the path that is already open and follows it without complaint. Many people believe strength means standing your ground against everything in your way. Lao Tzu believed something quieter, that the strongest beings are the ones who never needed to fight for space at all. He noticed that the things people fight hardest over are rarely the things that sustain them, and that the quiet, overlooked spaces often hold more than anyone bothered to check. Long ago, in a village built along a wide, slow river, there lived a young fisherman who had grown tired of arguing. Every season, the other fishermen claimed the best parts of the river, the deep pools, the shaded bends where fish gathered at dusk. Every season, he was pushed toward the shallow, sun-bleached stretch near the rocks, where the fishing was poor and the work was hard, his nets coming up morning after morning with little more than weed and silt. One evening, frustrated and empty-handed, his shoulders aching from a day of hauling nets for nothing, he walked upstream to where an old fisherman lived alone in a small reed hut. Smoke curled from a low fire near the doorway, and the smell of drying fish hung in the evening air. The old man was known throughout the village, though no one quite remembered his name anymore. They called him only the river keeper. "I want to learn how to take back my place on the river," the young man said, his voice rough with the day's frustration. "Every season the others crowd me out. I want to fish the deep pools too." The river keeper looked up from the net he was mending. He smiled, slow and unhurried, the way he always did before speaking. "Come with me," he said. They walked together along the bank until they reached a place where the river split in two around a large boulder, moss-covered and half-submerged. One side rushed and churned against the stone, throwing up white spray that caught the last orange light of evening. The other side moved quietly around it, almost unnoticed, sliding past in a smooth, dark current. "Tell me," the river keeper said, "which side of the river is stronger?" The young man pointed to the rushing side. "That one. Look how hard it fights the rock." "Watch a little longer," the river keeper said, lowering himself onto a flat rock with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. They sat. The young man noticed that the churning water, for all its noise, made no progress at all. It crashed and foamed in the same place, over and over, exactly where it had started. The quiet side, meanwhile, moved steadily past the boulder, reached the far bank, and continued downstream without ever slowing. "The loud water never gets anywhere," the young man said slowly. "It just keeps hitting the same rock." "Yes," said the river keeper. "And the quiet water has already reached the sea 3 times since we sat down." The young man frowned. "But I am not water. I am a man with empty nets. If I do not fight for my place on the river, I will starve." The river keeper said nothing for a while, only watching the loud water continue its useless churn against the boulder. "Tell me," he said eventually, "in all the seasons you have fought for the deep pools, have your nets ever come up as full as you hoped?" The young man considered this honestly. "No," he admitted. "Even when I won the argument and claimed a good spot, the fishing there was crowded. Too many nets in the same water. We thinned out whatever fish remained within days." "So the fight itself cost you something," the river keeper said, "even on the days you won it." "I had not thought of it that way," the young man said slowly. The river keeper was quiet for a while, watching the current. "Tell me," he said, "have you ever fished the shallow water near the rocks at first light, before the sun rises high?" "No," the young man admitted. "Everyone says the fish avoid the shallows. They avoid the shallows at midday, when the heat presses down and the water grows warm," the river keeper said. "At first light the shallows are cool, and the small fish gather there to feed before the larger ones wake. The deep pools the others fight over are crowded precisely because everyone believes they are the only good water. No one has thought to look elsewhere." The young man sat with this. So I do not need to fight for the deep pools at all. You do not need to fight for anything, the river keeper said. You only need to find the place no one else has thought to look. That place is rarely guarded, because no one believes it is worth guarding. The young man returned to the shallows the next morning before dawn, the sky still grey and the village asleep behind him, and cast his net where the water ran cool and clear over pale stones. The first haul came up nearly empty, and for a moment doubt crept back into his chest. But the second haul, drawn just as the sun broke the ridgeline, was heavy with silver bodies thrashing against the cord. He caught more fish in that single hour than he had in the deep pools all season. He never fought another fisherman for a place on the river again. Word spread through the village of the fisherman who had found his fortune in water, everyone else dismissed. A few of the older men tried the shallows themselves, grumbling, certain it was luck rather than method, but most stayed loyal to the crowded pools out of habit alone. The young man did not correct them. He simply kept rising before dawn, season after season, his nets never empty. Years later, when he had grown old himself, a young woman came to him with the same frustration he had once carried, the same tight jaw and empty hands. He only smiled, the way the river keeper once had, and led her down to the water without a word, pointing toward the pale stones glinting beneath the cool, overlooked current. In Lakota teaching, there is a similar understanding of finding strength without conflict. Lakota elders often speak of Wakantanka, the great mystery that moves through all living things, and of the importance of living in harmony with that movement rather than against it. A hunter does not force the herd to come to him. He learns the patterns of wind and grass, the quiet places the animals already favor, and he waits there with patience rather than pursuit. There is also a Lakota teaching about the circle, the idea that all things move in cycles, and that fighting against a cycle's natural turn causes suffering, while moving with it brings ease. The seasons are not forced to change. The buffalo are not forced to migrate. Each follows its own unhurried rhythm, and the wise person learns to recognize that rhythm rather than resist it. A hunter who insists on chasing the herd against the grain of its movement exhausts himself and his horse alike, while one who reads the season and waits at the path the herd will choose on its own spends far less effort for far more meat. Both lessons echo what the riverkeeper showed the young fisherman. The loudest, most aggressive approach to a problem is rarely the most effective one. The hunter who waits in the right place, like the water that finds the open channel, accomplishes more by attention than by force. In the Lakota tradition, as in the riverkeeper's quiet shallows, the world rewards those who notice what others overlook, rather than those who fight hardest for what everyone else already wants. Both traditions trust that the world already contains enough for everyone willing to look beyond the crowded, obvious places. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, the urge to compete loudly for something everyone else is already chasing. Think about a time you pushed hard for a promotion that 10 other people wanted too, exhausting yourself in a crowded race when a quieter opportunity sat unnoticed somewhere else. You may have felt this in a friendship or a family gathering, fighting to be heard in a room full of people talking over each other, when stepping back and listening might have served you better. Or think of a time you applied to the same well-known opportunity as everyone you knew, only to discover later that a smaller, overlooked option would have suited you far better, had you only thought to look. This shows up in ordinary life when you assume the only way forward is through the crowd everyone else has already chosen. The deep pool looks appealing because everyone is there. The shallow water looks unworthy because no one bothers with it. You might notice this in something as small as choosing the same crowded coffee line every morning out of habit, never once trying the quieter shop 2 streets further on. But there is often a quieter path, the one the riverkeeper pointed toward, not the busiest, but the one already open to you. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to fight for anything. Feel what it might be like to release the grip of competition entirely, the way the quiet side of the river simply continues past the rock toward the sea. Let that stillness carry you tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu often returned to a strange idea that the soft overcomes the hard and the weak overcomes the strong. He pointed to water as proof. Water has no edges, no fixed shape, nothing that looks like power at first glance. Yet given enough time, it wears down the hardest stone. Taoists call this the principle of softness overcoming hardness. It does not happen quickly. It happens patiently, one drop at a time, without anger and without rush. Lao Tzu believed this patient softness was the most underestimated force in the world, quietly stronger than anything that tries to meet force with force. He warned that those who prize only hardness eventually meet something harder still, while those who remain soft and adaptable rarely meet their match at all. In the hill country above a mountain village, there stood a great stone gate, said to have guarded the pass since before anyone could remember, its surface scarred by old siege fires and centuries of weather. A young soldier, newly assigned to defend the pass, grew obsessed with the gate's strength. He believed that if he could only make himself as hard and unyielding as that stone, nothing could ever defeat him. He trained relentlessly, striking wooden posts until his knuckles bled and cracked in the cold, holding rigid stances for hours while wind cut down from the passes, refusing rest even when his body begged for it, his legs trembling long after each session ended. One day, exhausted and bruised, his breath fogging in the thin mountain air, he climbed to a small shrine near the pass, where an old monk had lived in quiet solitude for decades. "I want to become as strong and unbreakable as the stone gate," the soldier said. "Tell me how." The monk, who was mending a torn robe by the light of a small fire, looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to already know where this conversation would lead. "Come outside," the monk said, setting his mending aside without complaint, as though he had been expecting this very question for some time. They walked together to a narrow stream that ran beside the shrine, its water dark and cold, threading between mossy banks. The monk knelt, robes brushing the wet stones, and pointed to a smooth, rounded stone resting in the stream bed, worn down to the shape of an egg. "Touch this stone," the monk said, lifting it from the cold stream bed and pressing it into the soldier's open hand. The soldier ran his fingers over it. It was perfectly smooth, without a single sharp edge. "This stone," the monk said, "broke off the mountain above us many years ago. It was jagged then, full of sharp corners, hard in every direction. Tell me, what made it this smooth?" "The water," the soldier said. The monk let the stream's steady murmur fill the pause before he spoke again. "And was the water trying to break the stone?" The soldier considered this. "I don't think water tries to do anything." "No," the monk agreed. "It simply moved the same way every day for years longer than either of us has lived. It never struck the stone harder out of frustration. It never gave up and went around. It simply continued being water, exactly as water is. And the stone, which seemed so much stronger, eventually yielded its shape." "But I do not have years," the soldier said. "I have a past to defend, and enemies who may come any day. I need to be strong now. Strength now does not mean rigidity now," the monk said. "Tell me, when you strike a wooden post until your knuckles bleed, what are you actually training? Your bones to be harder than wood? Or something else?" The soldier considered this, looking at his bruised hands. "I suppose I hoped my bones would grow harder, tougher." "And have they?" "A little," the soldier admitted. "But they ache more than they used to, and I am no faster than I was a year ago. If anything, I am slower, weighed down by all this hardness I have built." The monk was quiet for a moment, watching the stream. "Tell me," he said, "if two soldiers stood at that gate, one rigid as the stone gate itself, refusing to bend even slightly, and one who could absorb a blow and recover, who could move where the attack was not, which one do you think would still be standing at the end of a long battle?" The soldier hesitated. "The one who could move. And which one is more like water, and which is more like stone?" "The one who moves is like water," the soldier admitted. "But it feels strange to call that strength. It looks like weakness from the outside." "Many things that endure look weak from the outside, and many things that crumble first looked strongest," the monk said. "A reed bends nearly to the ground in a storm and stands again once the wind passes. An old oak, certain of its own solidity, sometimes falls in the very same storm, roots and all, because it never learned to give even an inch. Many strong things look like weakness from the outside," the monk said. "The stone gate has stood for 100 years because it does not move at all. But one day a great earthquake will come, and because it cannot bend even slightly, it will crack down the middle. The water in this stream will still be here the next morning, unharmed, already shaping the next stone." The soldier sat by the stream for a long time after the monk returned to his mending, listening to the water work patiently at stones it could not see beneath the surface. He did not stop training, but he changed how he trained. drilling footwork that shifted his weight rather than planted it, learning to absorb a strike through his whole body instead of bracing his shoulders against it, practicing falls until landing no longer frightened him. He returned to the shrine often that winter, and the monk would only nod when he saw the change, never praising it outright. The way water needs no praise to keep moving. Years later, when the pass was finally attacked, the stone gate did crack under the force of war machines, splitting along an old fault line no one had ever noticed, the rubble burying the very ground the soldier once thought was his only defense. But the soldier, who had learned to move like water, rolled clear of the falling stone, absorbed the shock of a blow that would once have shattered his rigid stance, and was still standing when the dust settled over the broken gate. In Stoic philosophy, there is a similar understanding of strength through flexibility rather than rigidity. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that we suffer most not from events themselves, but from our rigid resistance to events we cannot control. He compared the wise person to a well-rooted tree that bends in a storm rather than a brittle one that snaps. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic writer, kept a private journal reminding himself daily that obstacles were not enemies to be defeated by force, but conditions to be met with calm adaptability. He wrote that the impediment to action advances action, meaning that what blocks us directly can become, if we bend around it skillfully, the very thing that moves us forward. He wrote this not as a soldier far from danger, but as a man leading armies through plague and rebellion, finding daily that rigid certainty broke faster under pressure than a mind willing to adjust its plans. Both teachings point to the same quiet truth the monk offered the soldier. The Stoics did not believe a wise person should be passive or weak. They believed true strength was the capacity to remain steady on the inside while adapting endlessly on the outside, much like water, which never loses its essential nature even as it takes the shape of every container, every stream bed, every crack in the stone it eventually wears away. A soldier trained in this kind of strength does not need to predict every blow in advance. He only needs the suppleness to move with whatever blow actually arrives. You may know this tension yourself, the desire to become hard and unbreakable in the face of difficulty. Think about a time you braced yourself so completely for criticism at work that you could not hear anything useful in it, only the threat. You may have felt this in a relationship, holding so rigidly to being right that the conversation cracked instead of bending. Or think of a time your body itself went rigid before a hard conversation, your jaw set, your shoulders raised, long before a single word had actually been spoken against you. This shows up in ordinary life when you meet a setback with clenched resistance instead of flexible response. Holding your breath through an unexpected bill, refusing to adjust a plan that has clearly stopped working. It might also show up as arguing with weather you cannot change, growing irritable at a delayed train as though irritation itself could rearrange the schedule. But there is another way, the one the stream showed the soldier. Not hardness, but patient adaptability. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to be the stone gate. Feel what it is like to soften slightly, the way water settles into whatever shape the night offers you. Let your body remember that the same patient softness that wears down stone can carry you gently towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Tao Jing about the lowest place. Lao Tzu observed that water always seeks the lowest ground, the places others consider unworthy, and that this is precisely why rivers and oceans receive every stream that flows toward them. He believed the wisest people behave the same way. They do not climb over others to reach a high position. They are willing to occupy the humble, overlooked place, and because of this willingness, everything eventually flows toward them. Taoists sometimes call this the wisdom of the lowest place. It is the opposite of how most people try to gain influence, and yet Lao Tzu insisted it works. Season after season, in ways that ambition pursued loudly almost never manages on its own. In a kingdom known for its towering temples, there once lived a minister who desired more than anything to be noticed by the emperor. He spoke loudly in council, seated himself as close to the throne as protocol allowed, and made certain that every accomplishment of his, however small, reached the emperor's ears through carefully placed words to anyone who might repeat them. Despite all this effort, he was never promoted. Younger ministers, quieter ones who rarely spoke unless asked, kept rising past him, taking seats and titles he had coveted for years. Frustrated, his pride bruised more with each passing season, he sought out a retired adviser who had once served 3 emperors and was said to understand the workings of court better than anyone alive. "I have worked harder than any minister in the palace," the man said, "and still I am passed over. Tell me what I am doing wrong." The old adviser, sitting in a modest garden far from the palace's grand halls, dressed in plain grey rather than the silks his rank once entitled him to wear, smiled and gestured for the minister to sit beside a small pond at the garden's lowest corner, where dragonflies skimmed the still surface. "Do you see this pond?" the adviser asked, gesturing with an open palm toward the still water at the garden's lowest corner, where a single fallen blossom drifted slowly across the surface. The minister glanced at the still water, unimpressed at first by its plainness compared to the carved stone lanterns elsewhere in the garden. "Yes," he said, puzzled. "It is the lowest point in your garden. Every path slopes down toward it." "And where does the water from your garden's 3 springs eventually arrive?" "Here," the minister said. "All of it eventually ends up here." "Why do you think that is?" the adviser asked, watching a dragonfly settle briefly on a half-submerged stone. "Because this is the lowest ground," the minister said. "Water always finds the lowest ground." The adviser traced a slow circle in the air above the pond, following the paths the water had carved over years. "Yes," he said, "and tell me, does the pond demand that the springs send their water to it? Does it climb upward, fighting to reach the high places where the water begins?" "No," the minister admitted. "It simply stays low, and the water comes to it." "Tell me one more thing about this pond," the advisor said. "If a fourth spring suddenly appeared on the far hillside, do you think this pond would refuse its water simply because it had not asked for it?" The minister almost laughed. "Of course not. It would take whatever water came to it. That is its nature." "And do you take whatever counsel comes to you, minister, even from the lowest clerk in the palace? Or do you refuse it because it did not come from someone important enough to matter?" The minister fell quiet, recalling the times he had waved away a junior scribe's concern without truly listening. "Now tell me something else," the advisor said. "In the palace, who receives the most loyalty, the most information, the most quiet trust from servants and junior officials alike?" The minister thought about this. "The ministers who are approachable, the ones who do not flaunt their position. People bring them news freely because they are not afraid of being outshone or punished for speaking plainly." "And is that you?" The minister was silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "People are careful around me. They tell me only what they think I want to hear. You have spent years trying to be the mountain peak everyone looks up to," the advisor said. "But influence in this palace, like water in this garden, flows toward the low places, the people who do not need to be seen as important in order to be trusted. The emperor does not promote the loudest minister. He promotes the one whose counsel he trusts completely, and trust rarely grows where there is no humility to receive it." "But surely ambition matters," the minister said. "Surely a man must show his worth, or no one will ever notice him at all." "Ambition and humility are not opposites," the advisor said. "The pond does not lack water because it sits low. It has more water than any spring on the mountain because its low position is precisely what allows it to gather everything that flows." The minister returned to the palace and, for the first time in years, stopped angling for the seat closest to the throne. He chose instead a chair near the door where junior clerks and nervous petitioners passed most often. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was usually to ask a question rather than to make a claim. He let junior officials bring him their honest concerns without fear of being outshone, and when their information proved useful, he made certain credit reach them rather than himself. It did not happen quickly. For a full season, nothing seemed to change at all, and old habits tugged at him constantly, urging him back toward the seat by the throne. But slowly, almost without his noticing, servants began stopping at his door before anyone else's. Junior officials brought him troubling rumors they dared not bring to louder men. The emperor began to seek his counsel above all others, not because the minister had climbed any higher, but because he had finally learned to occupy the lowest, most trusted place in the room. In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding of strength through humility. The concept of ahimsa, often translated as non-harm, is closely tied to a deeper teaching about ego and the lowest place. Many Hindu teachers describe the river Ganga, sacred and life-giving, as an image of divine humility. She descends from the high Himalayas to the lowest plains precisely so that she can nourish everyone, the poorest farmer and the wealthiest king, without distinction. There is also the teaching of seva, selfless service performed without expectation of recognition. In many Hindu traditions, the greatest spiritual progress is said to come not from grand, visible acts, but from quiet, humble service, sweeping a temple floor, serving food to strangers, tending to the needs of others without any need to be thanked. Pilgrims at certain temples still queue for hours simply for the chance to perform such small, unseen tasks, believing the lowest work carries the same merit as any grand offering, sometimes more. Both teachings mirror what the advisor showed the minister in his garden. The river that descends rather than climbs becomes the one everyone depends upon. The servant who seeks no recognition often becomes the one most trusted with responsibility. In Hindu tradition, as in the wisdom of the lowest place, true influence rarely belongs to those who chase it loudly. It settles like water into those willing to remain low, the same way the holiest rivers in this tradition are revered not for their height, but for how completely they give themselves to the plains below. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, the instinct to prove your worth loudly, to make sure everyone notices your effort. Think about a time you spoke over a meeting just to be seen as valuable, when listening quietly might have earned more trust. You may have felt this at home, insisting on being right in a small disagreement, when simply letting it go would have opened more space for connection. Or think of a time you mentioned an accomplishment unprompted, hoping for praise, and noticed afterward how much heavier the moment felt than it needed to be. This shows up in ordinary life when you mistake visibility for value, when you believe you must climb to be respected, when you forget that the quietest, most humble presence in a room is often the one others trust the most. You might also notice it in how readily you interrupt to be helpful, when simply waiting might let someone else finish a thought worth hearing. But there is another way, the one the pond demonstrated without ever moving from its place. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to climb anywhere at all. Feel what it is like to simply settle, low and unhurried, the way water settles into the lowest corner of a garden at dusk. Let that same settling carry you gently into sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote that the spirit of the valley never dies. He described it as something empty, yet endlessly productive, like a hollow space that gives rise to everything that passes through it. This is not emptiness as absence. It is emptiness as potential, the kind that allows new water to keep arriving. A cup that is already full cannot receive more tea. A valley that insists on being a mountain cannot hold a river. Taoists call this the usefulness of emptiness. What looks like nothing, what looks nearly invisible, can be the very thing that makes everything else possible. The same way the space inside a house, not the walls themselves, is what makes a house worth living in. In the foothills below a mountain pass, there was a well that had served a small village for generations, its stones worn pale and round by centuries of rope and bucket. An old teacher lived beside it in a hut roofed with dried reeds, and travellers sometimes came to ask her questions before continuing their journey over the pass. One afternoon, a young scholar arrived, sweating from the climb, his satchel heavy with scrolls he had copied from every library he had visited across 3 provinces. He set the satchel down with a thud beside the well and wiped his brow, dust from the road still clinging to his sandals. "I have read everything I could find about wisdom," he said, "and still I feel I am missing something essential. Tell me what I have not yet learned." The old teacher was drawing water from the well with a wooden bucket. She smiled, the way she often did before answering anything directly, and handed him a cup. "Drink," she said, watching him with the patient attention of someone who had answered this exact frustration many times before in many different travellers. He drank. The water was cool and clean. "It is good water," he said. "What does this have to do with my question?" The teacher set the wooden bucket down beside the well's stone rim, where generations of rope had worn deep grooves into the lip. "Patience," she said. "First tell me how many scrolls you carry." 43, the scholar said, not without pride. "And how many of them have you read more than once?" He hesitated. "Perhaps 6. The teacher tapped the well's stone rim, then the boulder beside it, the contrast plain beneath her fingers. "Tell me," she said, "why does this well give water, while the stone beside it gives nothing at all?" The scholar looked at the stone, solid and unremarkable beside the well's opening. "Because the well is hollow," he said. "The stone is solid all the way through." The teacher set the wooden bucket down and rested a hand on the well's worn stone rim. "Yes," she said, "the well's only usefulness comes from the part of it that is empty. If we filled the well with more stone, more solid, dependable rock, it would no longer be a well. It would simply be more mountain." The scholar set down his cup. "But scrolls are not wells. Surely the more I learn, the more useful I become." "Tell me," the teacher said, "when your satchel was empty before your travels began, could you carry anything in it at all?" "No," he admitted. "An empty satchel carries nothing because it has nothing in it yet." "And now that it is full," she said, "could you add 1 more scroll to it without spilling something else out?" He considered the heavy satchel at his feet. "No, it is already full. I would have to remove something first to add anything new." "So which serves you better right now?" she asked. "The satchel that is completely full, or a little open space where 1 more idea might still fit?" The scholar was quiet for a long moment. "The open space," he said slowly. "But it feels strange. I have spent years trying to fill myself with knowledge. You are telling me the empty part was the valuable part all along." "Not instead of the knowledge," the teacher said. "Alongside it. A cup with no room left cannot hold new tea, no matter how excellent the tea being poured. A mind with no room left cannot hold a new thought, no matter how true that thought might be. You have filled your satchel admirably. Now you must learn to keep a little of yourself unfilled, the way this well keeps its center hollow, on purpose, every single day." "But surely some scholars are wiser for having filled themselves so completely," the young man said, unwilling yet to abandon what he had built. "Surely the satchel itself proves something about my dedication." "It proves your dedication," the teacher agreed. "It does not prove your wisdom. I have met scholars whose satchels held every scroll ever written, and who still could not hear a simple truth spoken plainly by a child, because there was no room left inside them for anything they had not already decided to believe." She set down her own bucket and gestured toward the village beyond the well. "There was a merchant who passed through here last winter," she said, "carrying twice what his cart could properly bear. Every basket, every sack, every jar stacked higher than the last. When a storm caught him on the road, his cart tipped, and he lost almost everything, because there had been no room left to shift the weight when the ground gave way beneath one wheel. A lighter cart, half as full, would have simply rocked and steadied itself." "You are saying I am that cart," the scholar said. "I am saying every mind that refuses to leave any space empty eventually meets a storm it cannot shift its weight around," she said. "The well has never tipped over in all the years it has stood here. It has nothing in it to spill." "How does one practice emptiness," the scholar asked, "without simply forgetting everything I have worked to learn?" "You do not need to forget anything," she said. "You only need to stop insisting that every space inside you must be occupied. Sit by this well sometimes. Notice that its emptiness is not a flaw waiting to be corrected. It is the entire reason villagers walk this road to find it." The scholar stayed at the well through the evening, watching travellers come and go, each one drawing from the same hollow centre, each one leaving a little lighter than they arrived. A farmer stopped to water a tired mule. Two children filled clay jugs for their mother, laughing as water splashed over their bare feet. None of them remarked on the well's emptiness. None of them needed to. They simply used it, the way it had always been used, precisely because it had never been filled with anything else. He did not unpack his satchel that night. He simply sat beside the well, listening to the small sounds of the village settling into evening, and for the first time in years did not try to fill the quiet with anything at all. No recitation, no review of facts, no rehearsal of an argument he might make to some future scholar who doubted him. In the morning, before he continued his journey, he left one scroll behind, tucked beneath a stone near the well's rim, for the next traveller who might need a little more room of their own. He did not write his name on it. It felt somehow more fitting to leave it the way the well left its water, freely, without needing credit for the gift. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding of the usefulness of emptiness. The concept of shunyata, often translated as emptiness, does not describe a bleak nothingness. It describes the open, spacious quality that allows all things to arise, change, and pass without becoming permanently fixed. A bowl can hold rice precisely because it is not already full of stone. There is also the Buddhist image of the empty cup, often used by meditation teachers when a student arrives certain of their own conclusions. A cup that is already full, the teaching goes, cannot receive what a teacher offers, no matter how carefully it is poured. The student must first set down some of what they believe they already know. One well-known account tells of a master continuing to pour tea into a visiting scholar's cup long after it overflowed onto the table, simply to show the scholar what his own crowded mind already looked like to everyone around him. Both teachings echo what the well showed the scholar. Shunyata is not the absence of value. It is the condition that makes value possible at all. The well, the cup, and the open mind all share this same quiet structure. In Buddhist tradition, as in the old teacher's wisdom, the parts of us that feel emptiest are sometimes the parts doing the most essential work, quietly making room for whatever still needs to arrive, the way a held breath only becomes useful again the moment it is finally released. You may know this feeling already, the sense that your days are so full there is no room left for anything new. Think about a calendar packed so tightly with obligations that an unexpected good opportunity has nowhere to land. You may have felt this in conversation, so certain of your own opinion that nothing the other person said could actually reach you. Or think of an evening so crowded with screens and noise that a quiet, good idea, the kind that only arrives in stillness, simply had nowhere left to surface. This shows up in ordinary life when you treat rest as wasted time, when you fill every silence with a podcast or a scrolling thumb, when you forget that some of the most useful parts of a day are the parts where nothing in particular is happening. A second version of this might be a weekend scheduled so tightly with errands and plans that there is no remaining hour for an idle thought to surface on its own. But there is another way. The one the well demonstrates simply by remaining hollow. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to fill anything. Feel what it is like to let a little space remain open inside you, the way the well keeps its center empty on purpose. Let that same emptiness, unhurried and unfilled, carry you gently towards sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the way that can be forced is not the lasting way. True movement, he believed, comes through Wu Wei, or Wu Wei, action that does not strain against the nature of things. Water never forces a flood to recede. It waits, and in waiting it finds its own level again. This is not passivity. It is a kind of trust that things settle in their own time, without our hands clenched around the outcome. Lao Tzu called this effortless action. The river does not work harder during a flood. It simply continues being a river, until the flood remembers how to become a river again too. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing at all. It means acting in a way that fits so naturally with what the moment already requires that the action barely feels like effort. In a small village near a wide river, there lived a rabbi known for his quiet patience. One spring, after weeks of heavy rain, the river rose far beyond its banks and flooded half the village, ruining grain stores, drowning chicken coops, and filling cellars with brown, silt-thick water that smelled of mud and rot. A young farmer came to the rabbi's door late one evening, soaked through, exhausted from days of trying to dig channels to redirect the flood before it reached his fields, his palms blistered and his boots heavy with clay. "Rabbi, tell me what prayer will make this water recede faster," the farmer said. "I have dug until my hands are raw, and still the water rises. The rabbi, who had been sitting at his window watching the rain through the glass, smiled gently and invited the farmer inside. "Sit," the rabbi said, pulling a second chair close to the small fire crackling in the hearth. "Warm yourself first." "There is no time," the farmer said. "Every hour I waste, more grain is ruined." "Tell me," the rabbi said, "in all your digging these past 3 days, has the flood gone down even a finger's width because of your effort?" The farmer hesitated. "No," he admitted. "If anything, it has risen more." "And do you believe the river enjoys flooding your field? Do you believe it is doing this to punish you?" "No," the farmer said. "It is only doing what rivers do when too much rain falls." "Then tell me," the rabbi said, "what do you think will make the water recede if not your digging?" The farmer thought for a moment. "The rain must stop, and then in time the river finds its banks again." "Yes," the rabbi said. "It always has, every spring, for longer than either of us has lived. Tell me one more thing. While you have been digging these 3 days, raw-handed and exhausted, what has not been tended at home?" The farmer's face fell. "My children. My wife has managed alone. I have not slept beside her in 3 nights. The rabbi nodded slowly. "There is an old teaching among my people," he said. "We do not believe every problem is solved by our own striving. Some problems are solved by the turning of the world itself in its own time, and our task is simply to remain faithful and present while that turning happens. This is not laziness, it is trust." "I have always believed faith and effort stood opposed to one another," the farmer admitted. "That choosing one meant abandoning the other." "They are not opposed," the rabbi said. "A man drowning does not need more effort. He needs to stop thrashing long enough to float. The thrashing itself is what pulls him under." The farmer looked down at his raw, blistered palms, turning them over in the firelight. "I have thrashed for 3 days," he said quietly, "and the water has not noticed at all." "It never does," the rabbi said. "Floods do not measure how hard a man fights them. They measure only rainfall and the slope of the land and time. None of those things have ever once asked your permission, and none of them ever will. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is, I think, a freeing one, once a man finally stops expecting otherwise." "But surely I cannot simply do nothing while my field is under water," the farmer said. "I did not say do nothing," the rabbi said. "I said stop fighting the flood with your bare hands as though your strength alone could outmuscle the sky. Go home, hold your children, bank the grain you can still save to higher ground, then wait, the way the river itself is waiting for the water to remember its own banks." The farmer returned home that evening. He moved what grain remained to the loft, held his children close by the fire while his wife warmed broth over the hearth, and slept beside her for the first time in days, the rain still tapping steadily against the shutters. The next morning, instead of returning to the channels he had dug, he mended a fence, repaired a tool, sat with his eldest son, and taught him a song his own father had once sung during a flood years before. The rain continued through that day and the next, but by then it had nothing left of his strength to demand. 3 days later, as it always eventually did, the river receded, leaving behind a wide brown scar of flattened grass and silted fields. The farmer walked his fields again, surveying what the flood had taken and what remained. It was less than he had feared, and more than his raw hands could have saved through force alone. Some rows of grain had survived simply because the water had chosen on its own not to reach them. He visited the rabbi once more, not with a question this time, but simply to sit with him a while by the window, watching the river settle quietly back into its banks, brown water clearing slowly toward its ordinary color. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding of trust during difficulty. The concept of bitachon, often translated as trust, describes a deep confidence that the world unfolds according to a larger order, even when our own efforts cannot fully control the outcome. The Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement, often taught that anxious striving could close a person off from the very help they needed, while a calm, open heart remained ready to receive it. There is also a Hasidic teaching about the concept of hishtadlus, the effort a person is still required to make, paired always with bitachon. The two are not opposites. A person plants the seed and tends the field, this teaching holds, but does not believe the harvest depends solely on the strength of their own arms. The growing itself belongs to something larger. Stories are told of farmers who worked their fields with full diligence through difficult seasons, yet released their grip each evening, trusting that rain, sun, and soil would do the part no human hand could ever force. Both teachings mirror what the rabbi offered the farmer beside his flooded field. Effort and trust were never meant to compete with each other. Bitachon does not ask a person to stop acting. It asks them to stop believing that gripping harder will ever be the thing that makes a flood recede, much the way the river was always going to find its banks again, regardless of how raw the farmer's hands became. Both traditions agree that the deepest peace comes not from controlling every outcome, but from trusting the larger order even while continuing, faithfully, to do one's own small part within it. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, the urge to dig harder against a problem that simply needs time to resolve on its own. Think about a time you stayed up too late refreshing an email, trying to will a response into existing sooner, when nothing about your worry actually sped up the reply. You may have felt this during an illness, pushing your body to recover on your schedule rather than its own, when rest would have served you better than striving. Or think of a difficult relationship you tried to repair through sheer insistence, pressing for resolution before the other person was ready, when a little patience might have let things mend on their own. This shows up in ordinary life when you mistake exhaustion for diligence, when you believe that suffering through a problem proves how much you care, when you forget that some floods recede only with patience, never with force. It might also appear as guilt for resting while a problem remains unsolved, as though your own discomfort was somehow required for the resolution to count. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to dig against anything. Feel what it is like to set your hands down, the way the farmer finally set his shovel aside. Let that same trust, the quiet kind that waits for water to find its own level, carry you gently toward sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu often spoke of stillness as the root of all movement. He believed that a restless mind, like a churned pond, could never reflect anything clearly, while a still mind, even amid a busy life, could mirror the world exactly as it was. This is not stillness as inactivity. It is stillness as clarity, the kind that lets the moon's reflection rest undisturbed on the surface of a quiet pool. Taoists describe this as returning to the root, settling back to a calm center, even while the surface of life keeps moving. The pond does not stop the wind from blowing across it. It simply settles again the moment the wind passes, never holding a grievance against the gust that disturbed it. Behind a small mountain temple, there was a still pond where a Zen master often sat in the early morning before her students woke, mist curling low over the water, while birds began their first calls in the cedar branches above. One day, a young monk who had grown frustrated with his own restless thoughts came to find her there, his sandals damp from the dew-heavy grass. "Master, I cannot quiet my mind," he said. "Every time I sit to meditate, my thoughts churn like a storm. I have tried forcing them still, and still they will not obey." The master, who was watching the pond's surface, smiled without looking up. "Sit beside me," she said. The monk sat. The pond was perfectly still. The temple roofline reflected on its surface without a single ripple. "Throw a stone into the water," the master said, nodding toward a small pile of pebbles worn smooth by years of exactly this lesson. The monk picked up a small stone and threw it. Ripples spread outward, breaking the temple's reflection into shifting fragments. "Now make the water still again," the master said. "Force it, the way you force your thoughts." The monk reached down and pressed his palms against the surface, trying to flatten the ripples by hand. The water only churned more, splashing onto his sleeves. "This is not working," he said, frustrated. "No," the master agreed. "Stop. Take your hands away." The monk withdrew his hands and sat back. The ripples continued for a moment, then slowly on their own, the water settled. Within a minute, the temple roofline appeared again, whole and clear. "You did nothing that time," the master observed, "and the water became still faster than when you forced it." "But I threw the stone," the monk said. "Surely that was my doing too." "Yes," the master said, "and the stone is like a thought or a feeling or a memory that arrives uninvited. You did not choose for it to land in the water, but once it has landed, tell me, does the pond fight the ripples, or does it simply allow them to spread and settle in their own time?" "It allows them," the monk said, watching the last fragments of the temple's reflection knit themselves back together at the pond's edge. "And what happened when you tried to force the stillness with your hands?" "It made things worse," the monk admitted. "The water churned more, not less." "This is the mistake almost every student makes," the master said. "They believe stillness is something to be manufactured through effort. But stillness is not manufactured. It is uncovered the moment we stop disturbing what was already settling on its own." I have sat for hours trying to manufacture exactly that kind of stillness, the monk said, and felt only more agitated by my own failure to achieve it. Of course, the master said, effort applied toward stillness becomes its own ripple. You cannot use force to arrive at the absence of force. It is like trying to fall asleep by commanding your body to sleep. The commanding itself keeps you awake. She picked up a second stone and turned it over in her palm without throwing it. "Watch what I do not do," she said. "I do not throw this one. And notice, the pond does not become more still because of my restraint either. It was already exactly as still as it needed to be, whether I threw a stone or not. My choice changes only what appears on the surface, never the water's underlying nature." The monk watched the unthrown stone, turning the thought over slowly. "So the stillness was never something I needed to create at all," he said. "Only something I kept interrupting." "Yes," the master said. "And once you stop interrupting it, you will find it was patient enough to wait for you the entire time." The monk frowned slightly. "Then what am I meant to do during meditation if not work towards stillness?" "Sit the way this pond sits," she said. "Let the thought stones fall where they fall. Do not press your palms against the ripples. Do not chase them away, and do not follow them outward either. Simply remain, the way the pond remains, beneath whatever moves across its surface." The monk sat with her a while longer, watching the pond reflect the temple, the sky a single drifting cloud. He noticed for the first time that the stillness had never actually left the water. It had only been waiting beneath the ripples for him to stop interfering. He returned to his meditation cushion that evening with a different intention. He did not try to empty his mind. He simply let his thoughts rise and settle, the way ripples rise and settle on a pond no one is touching. A memory of his mother surfaced, then a worry about an unfinished letter, then the sound of wind in the eaves. He let each one arrive, spread and fade, without chasing any of them outward, and without pressing his hands against any of them. By the time the temple bell rang for evening prayers, his mind, like the water behind the temple, had found its own quiet reflection again, the roofline of his thoughts settled and whole. He told the master the next morning that he had slept more soundly than he had in months. She only nodded, returning her gaze to the pond, where the same stillness waited beneath the surface, patient as ever for anyone willing to stop disturbing it. In Japanese Zen tradition, there is a similar understanding of stillness beneath movement. The concept of mushin, often translated as no mind, describes a state in which the mind responds to each moment without clinging or resisting, much like water that takes whatever shape its container offers without losing its essential clarity. A swordsman trained in mushin does not force his mind still through gritted effort. He simply stops obstructing the stillness that was already present. There is also the Zen garden tradition, where raked gravel forms ripple patterns around still stones, intended to be contemplated rather than disturbed. Zen gardeners often describe this practice as revealing stillness rather than creating it. The patterns already exist in the gravel's nature. The rake only uncovers what stillness was waiting beneath the surface. A gardener tending such a space for decades may rake the same small plot thousands of times, never finishing it, never needing to, the unfinished quality itself part of the lesson. Both teachings mirror what the pond showed the young monk. Mushin and the garden's quiet ripples both insist that calm is not something built through strain. It is something allowed. The same way the temple's reflection returned to the pond the instant the monk stopped pressing his hands against the water, the surface settling not because he made it so, but because he finally let it. A swordsman who has trained for decades in Mushin often describes the feeling not as emptiness, but as a kind of full, quiet readiness, the same readiness a still pond holds just beneath whatever passes across its surface. You may know this struggle already, trying to force a racing mind still before sleep, only to feel it churn more the harder you push. Think about a night you lay in bed, commanding yourself to relax, and felt your shoulders tighten instead. You may have felt this during an argument, trying to will your anger to disappear immediately, only to have it spread further the more you fought it. Or think of a worry that grew larger the more you tried to reason it away, settling instead the moment you finally let it simply sit, unargued with, for a while. This shows up in ordinary life when you treat calm as something to be muscled into existence, when you forget that the mind, like a pond, settles best when no one is pressing against its surface. It can also show up as gritting your teeth through a wave of anxiety, willing it to vanish immediately, when simply naming it and letting it pass might have settled it sooner. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to force anything still. Feel what it is like to simply stop pressing, the way the monk finally took his hands away from the water. Let your thoughts rise and settle on their own, the way ripples always do, and let that quiet returning carry you gently towards sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote that great rivers and seas are able to receive the streams of 100 valleys because they sit lower than all of them. He used this image to describe leadership without domination. The idea that those who wish to guide others must first learn to serve them, the way the ocean serves every river that empties into it without ever demanding tribute. This is not weakness disguised as virtue. It is a recognition that true influence flows downward, toward whoever is willing to receive rather than command. Lao Tzu believed the sea's vastness was not despite its low position, but entirely because of it. He used this image often to caution rulers against mistaking height for greatness, reminding them that no mountain peak has ever held as much water as a single humble sea. On a windswept coast where cold rivers ran down from the hills into the sea, there lived a chieftain's daughter who had been raised to believe that leading meant standing above everyone else. She trained with the warriors until her arms ached, spoke first at every council before the elders had even settled into their seats, and grew frustrated that her people seemed to follow her out of duty rather than devotion, their eyes lowered respectfully but rarely warm. She sought out an old druid who lived near the river mouth, where fresh water met salt water in a wide, slow-moving estuary. "I have done everything a leader should do," she said. "I speak boldly. I stand at the front of every gathering. And still my people's loyalty feels thin, like something owed rather than given." The druid, who was watching the tide come in, smiled and beckoned her to sit on a flat rock at the water's edge. "Watch the estuary," he said, settling himself onto the flat rock with the unhurried ease of a man who had watched this same tide 10,000 times before and never once grown tired of it. She watched. The river poured steadily down from the hills, and the sea rose to meet it, the two waters mixing and swirling together without any visible struggle. "Tell me," the druid said, "does the sea command the river to join it?" "No," she said, "the river simply flows downward, and the sea is already there to receive it." She let the silence sit a moment before continuing. "I once knew a chieftain 2 valleys from here," the druid said, "who built his hall on the highest hill he could find, certain that height itself commanded respect. His own sons stopped visiting him within a few winters. The climb, they said, had grown too steep for an old man's company to be worth it." He let a long, silent stretch pass, the tide creeping a little further up the wet sand between them. "And which one would you say holds more water, the river, rushing proudly down from the mountain, or the sea, sitting quietly at the bottom of every valley in this land?" "The sea," she said, "by far." "Why do you think that is?" She considered this. "Because every river eventually reaches it. Because the sea is lower than all of them." "Yes," the druid said, "the sea has never needed to chase a single river. It only needed to remain low enough, open enough, that every river found its own way home. But the sea also never speaks," the chieftain's daughter said. "It never commands, never advises, never settles a dispute among the fish that live within it. How can a leader be useful while remaining so silent?" "The sea is not silent," the druid said. "It simply does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Every creature within it knows exactly where the deep water lies, where the warmth gathers, where the danger waits. The sea communicates constantly through its very shape without ever needing to shout." She watched a flock of gulls wheel low over the estuary, settling without argument onto a sandbar exposed by the falling tide. "Even the birds know this," the druid said. "They do not fight each other for that sandbar. There is room enough, the tide tells them so, and they trust the telling without a single cry of protest." The chieftain's daughter watched the tide a while longer, turning this over, the gulls settling and resettling in their unhurried way along the wet sand. The chieftain's daughter frowned. "But I am not a body of water. I am a leader. If I do not stand at the front, if I do not command attention, my people may forget I am meant to guide them." The druid was quiet for a while, watching gulls circle above the estuary. "Tell me," he said, "when your people bring you their troubles, their grief, their disputes over land or livestock, do they come to you because you command them to, or because they trust you will receive what they bring without judgment?" "I want to believe it is trust," she said, "but lately it feels more like obligation." "And when was the last time you sat with one of your people simply to listen, without already deciding what you would say in response?" She thought hard and found she could not remember. "There is an old wisdom among our people," the Druid said. "We say the most respected chieftain is not the one who stands tallest on the hill, but the one whose door is always open at the bottom of it, the one everyone can reach without climbing first. You have been standing on the hill. Perhaps it is time to walk down to where the rivers actually meet the sea." The chieftain's daughter returned to her hall that season and changed how she led. She sat lower in council, often on a simple bench rather than the carved chair her position allowed, let elders and even children speak before she did, and made her door, both literal and otherwise, easier to reach, removing the guard who had once turned petitioners away during her busier hours. The change unsettled some of her warriors at first, who worried a quieter chieftain meant a weaker one, but within a season fishermen began bringing her news of storms before anyone asked. An old widow walked 3 miles simply to tell her, unprompted, about a dispute brewing between 2 families before it could turn to violence. Her people's loyalty did not change overnight, but slowly, the way an estuary fills with each season's rain, it deepened into something that no longer felt owed, but freely given, river after river, season after season. In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding of leadership through openness rather than dominance. Ancient Celtic societies often honored the chieftain whose hall remained open to travelers and the poor, believing that true authority was proven not by how high a person stood, but by how freely they offered hospitality to those with nothing to repay them. This custom, sometimes called the law of hospitality, held that turning away a stranger in need diminished a leader far more than any battlefield defeat. There is also the Celtic reverence for sacred wells and river confluences, places where 2 waters met and were considered thresholds to the other world. Pilgrims left offerings not at mountain peaks, but at these low, water-gathered places, believing the gods themselves were closer to the ground where rivers pooled than to any high, dry summit. Some of these wells are still visited today, their stones draped with small ribbons left by travelers who continue, without quite knowing why, to seek blessing at the lowest point of the land rather than the highest. Both customs mirror what the Druid showed the chieftain's daughter. Hospitality and sacred wells both honor the same low, receptive posture as the sea meeting every river without demand. In Celtic tradition, as in the wisdom of the estuary, the most revered places and people were rarely the highest. They were the ones positioned to receive whatever arrived openly, without condition, the threshold rather than the summit, the open door rather than the closed gate. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, believing that to be respected, you must always speak first, stand tallest, or hold the most visible position in a room. Think about a time you dominated a family discussion to prove your competence, only to notice afterward that no one had actually felt heard, including you. You may have felt this at work, insisting on being the one with answers, when the team might have trusted you more had you simply asked better questions and listened to what came back. Or think of a friend who confided something difficult in you, not because you seemed impressive, but because you seemed safe enough, low enough, easy enough to reach. This shows up in ordinary life when you confuse authority with elevation, when you forget that the people you love often trust you most, not when you are impressive, but when you are reachable. You might notice it in a habit of correcting small details in casual conversation, needing to be the one who knows best, even when being right changes nothing for anyone listening. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to stand on any hill at all. Feel what it is like to settle low and open, the way the sea waits quietly for every river to find its own way home. Let that same openness carry you gently towards sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the 10,000 things rise and fall together, each one dependent on all the others, the way every raindrop depends on the ocean it eventually returns to. He did not see strength as something a person carries alone. He saw it as something shared, passed between people the way water passes between the soil, the root, and the leaf, each one giving and receiving in turn. Taoists sometimes call this the interdependence beneath the 10,000 things. No single drop survives the desert by insisting on its own separateness. It survives by remembering it was always part of something larger, the way a single reed bends and survives a storm that would snap a tree standing entirely alone. In a village built around a single deep spring, there lived an elder known for settling disputes that no one else could resolve. Her counsel sought even by families from neighboring settlements 2 days' walk away. One season, after a long drought had cracked the surrounding fields and left several families low on water, a young man came to her in anger, dust still clinging to his sandals from the dry walk to her hut. "My neighbor's livestock drink from the spring before mine do each morning," he said. "I have asked him to wait his turn, and he refuses. I want you to forbid him from the spring until my own animals have had their share." The elder, who was sitting beneath a fig tree near the spring's edge, listened without interrupting. When the young man finished, she smiled gently and asked him to walk with her. They approached the spring together. It bubbled up slowly from a crack in the rock, filling a shallow basin before trickling out toward the fields below. She let him sit with his frustration a moment, the spring bubbling quietly beside them, unhurried by his anger. "Tell me," the elder said, "where does this water come from?" "From the rock," the young man said, "from somewhere deep beneath it." The elder waited, letting the question settle the way water settles into low ground. "And before it reached the rock?" she asked again, watching him turn the question over slowly in his mind. He considered this. "From rain, I suppose," the young man said, watching the water bubble up steadily from its crack in the stone. "From rain that fell on the hills long before either of us were born." The elder watched a small bird dip low to drink from the spring's edge before flying off again. "And the rain," she said, "where did it come from?" The young man glanced upward as if he might catch the answer drifting somewhere overhead. "From clouds. From the sea eventually, I imagine." "So this spring," the elder said, "is not really separate from the sea at all. It is the sea, returned to us in a different form, after a long and patient journey through sky and stone." "I suppose that is true," the young man said, "but I still do not see what this has to do with my neighbor's livestock drinking before mine." "There is a saying among our people," the elder said, "I am because we are. A person does not become whole alone, the way a single drop of rain cannot become a river by itself. It becomes a river only by joining every other drop around it. But if I let him drink first every morning, my own animals suffer for it," the young man said. "Tell me," the elder said, "has the spring ever run dry because two herds drank from it instead of one?" The young man paused. "No, not in my memory." "And if your neighbor's animals grow weak from thirst this season, while yours remains strong, do you believe your family will be untouched by his hardship? Will his hungry children not wander near your fields? Will his weakened herd not affect the prices at market for everyone, including you?" The young man was quiet for a long moment. "I had not thought of it that way," he admitted. "I only saw my own animals and his animals as separate from each other. This is the most common mistake among neighbors," the elder said. "Each one watches only their own basin, their own herd, their own field, and forgets that all of it drinks from the same hidden water underground." The elder bent and cupped a little water from the basin, letting it run slowly back between her fingers. "Tell me," she said, "if I divide this handful of water in two, does either half remain whole on its own, or does each half simply become a smaller portion of the same water it always was?" "A smaller portion," the young man said. "It does not become something new by being divided." "Just so," she said. "Your herd and his herd are not two separate waters drawn from two separate springs. They are one water divided by your eyes into two, though the spring itself has never recognized the division." "Then what would you have me do?" the young man asked, "if not forbid him from the spring?" "They have never truly been separate," the elder said. "No more than this spring is separate from the rain, or the rain from the sea. Your strength and his strength rise and fall together, whether either of you wishes it or not. The question is not how to keep the water only for yourself. The question is how both herds drink, and the spring still has enough for tomorrow." The young man returned to his neighbor that evening, not with a demand, but with a question. How might they arrange the mornings so that both herds drank well and neither family went without? His neighbor, expecting another argument, listened with visible surprise before answering. Together they devised a simple rotation, switching which family drank first each week, and agreed to warn each other if either herd seemed to be suffering more than the rotation allowed. The drought did not end any sooner for their agreement. The fields remained cracked, the rains stayed distant, and both families still worried nightly about their thinning herds. But the village noticed, in the weeks that followed, that the spring seemed to stretch further than anyone expected. Shared as it was between two families who had finally stopped treating its water as something to be hoarded. Other households, watching the arrangement hold, began quietly adopting similar rotations of their own, until the whole village seemed to draw from the spring with a little less fear than before. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, there is a similar understanding of interdependence. The phrase, often translated as "I am because we are," describes a worldview in which a person's humanity is inseparable from the humanity of those around them. A person cannot truly flourish, this teaching holds, while their community suffers the way no single drop of water can remain healthy while the spring around it runs dry. There is also the Ubuntu practice of communal decision-making, where disputes are resolved not by determining a single winner, but by restoring balance to the relationships involved. Elders in many African communities have long served this role, much like the elder beside the spring, guiding both sides toward an arrangement that preserves the well-being of the whole village rather than the advantage of one family. These gatherings often continue for hours, sometimes days, because restoring a relationship is understood to matter more than reaching a quick verdict. Both teachings mirror what the elder showed the young man. Ubuntu insists that strength and scarcity ripple outward, touching everyone eventually, the same way every raindrop in that spring had once been part of the same far-off sea. In Ubuntu tradition, as in the wisdom of the shared spring, no person's well-being is ever truly separate from their neighbors. A recognition that turns even a drought into an invitation toward closeness rather than competition. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, treating a shared resource, a shared kitchen, a shared project as something to be claimed rather than tended together. Think about a time you guarded your own convenience at work without considering how it rippled outward to a tired colleague picking up what you left behind. You may have felt this at home, insisting on your own comfort during a disagreement, forgetting that your family's peace and your own peace were never actually two separate things. Or think of a moment you helped a stranger with no expectation of return, and noticed how the small kindness seemed to settle something in you, as much as in them. This shows up in ordinary life, when you forget that your well-being and the well-being of those around you rise and fall together, the way every drop in a spring depends on the same far-off rain. A second example might be celebrating a personal success while overlooking the colleagues, family, and quiet circumstances that helped carry you there alongside your own effort. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to hold anything only for yourself. Feel what it is like to remember you are part of something larger, the way the spring's water was always part of the sea long before it reached you. Let that same belonging carry you gently towards sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the sage travels without fixed plans and arrives without ever having struggled toward arrival. This sounds like a paradox. Until you watch water find the sea, it does not consult a map. It reads the land itself, the tilt of every slope, the give of every soft bank, and lets that reading guide its course. Taoists call this attentiveness to the way things already are, rather than the way we wish to force them. A river does not need to know the ocean's exact location. It only needs to keep noticing which way is lowest, moment to moment, and trust that this noticing is enough. This same attentiveness, Lao Tzu suggested, serves a person far better than any rigid plan drawn up long before the actual terrain reveals itself. On an island surrounded by open ocean, there lived a master navigator who had crossed more open water than anyone in living memory, guided by nothing but stars, swells, and the flight patterns of birds, her skin weathered brown from decades of sun and salt spray. A young apprentice came to her one evening, frustrated after weeks of failed lessons, his notes scratched out and rewritten so many times the page had begun to tear. "I cannot read the ocean the way you do," he said. "I stare at the waves and see nothing but waves. I watch the stars and see nothing but lights. Tell me the secret to finding land without a map." The navigator, sitting on the beach watching the tide pull back from the sand, smiled and patted the ground beside her. "Sit," she said. "Watch the water leave the shore." The first stars were beginning to appear above the dark line of the horizon, faint and scattered, waiting for full dark to sharpen them. The apprentice sat. The tide drew back slowly, leaving wet sand and small pools behind. "Tell me," she said, "where is the swell coming from tonight?" He watched the waves a while. He watched the dark water a long moment, feeling the rhythm of it more than seeing it. "From the southeast, I think." The navigator nodded slowly, satisfied, and let the silence stretch a moment before continuing. "And does that swell ever change direction, even slightly, as it moves past this point?" He watched more carefully this time, narrowing his eyes against the dim starlight reflecting off the water. "Yes, it bends a little here near the rocks." The navigator smiled, pleased, the way a teacher smiles when a student finally notices something on his own. "Why do you think it bends?" The apprentice considered the dark water a long moment, feeling for an answer rather than reasoning his way toward one. "Something beneath the surface, perhaps. A reef or a change in the sea floor." The navigator nodded, satisfied, and rested her weathered hand briefly against the cool sand. "Yes," she said, "there is an island 3 days from here that you cannot see, cannot smell, cannot hear. But its presence bends this very swell, even at this distance, the same way a stone bends the current of a stream. The ocean is never simply ocean. It is always also a message about everything it has touched." "But how do I learn to read a message I cannot see written anywhere?" the apprentice asked. "You do not read it with your eyes alone," she said. "You read it with your whole body, over years, the way you learned to recognize your mother's footstep before you could see her face. Tell me, when you're at sea and feel unexpectedly seasick, what has usually changed?" The apprentice thought. "The motion of the swell sometimes. It feels different beneath the canoe." "And what does that different motion sometimes tell us?" "That we are nearing land," he said slowly, "even before we can see it." "Then you already know more than you believe," she said. You have been waiting for a map, a fixed line drawn ahead of time telling you exactly where to go. But the ocean does not give maps. It gives signs in this moment, and the moment after that, and the moment after that. The navigator does not memorize a single path to the destination. She learns to keep noticing, breath by breath, which way the water is already leading her. But what happens, the apprentice asked, when the signs contradict each other, when the swell suggests one direction and the birds suggest another? Then you trust the one closest to your body, she said. The swell rarely lies. Birds sometimes wander far from land, chasing a school of fish. You will learn, with enough seasons at sea, which signs deserve the most trust in a given moment. This, too, is not written in any map. It is learned only by paying attention, voyage after voyage, until the noticing becomes as natural as breathing. It frightens me, the apprentice admitted, to trust something I cannot write down and check later. It frightened me too, the first 10 times I crossed open water with nothing but the swell beneath my hands, the navigator said. But tell me, in all those years, when have you known your own mother's footstep to lie to you? You did not learn that sound from a list either. You learned it the same way you will learn the ocean, by listening so many times that the knowing simply becomes part of you. The apprentice sat with this for a long while, watching the tide continue its slow retreat. So I am not failing to find the way, he said. I am only failing to notice what the way already looks like. Yes, the navigator said, smiling. The ocean has never hidden anything from you. You have simply been looking for a destination when you should have been listening for a direction. In the seasons that followed, the apprentice spent less time staring anxiously at distant horizons and more time noticing the small details beneath his hands, the angle of swell against the hull, the particular birds that flew only near land, the smell of vegetation carried faintly on certain winds, the subtle color change where one current met another. His first solo crossing came 2 years later, a short journey between 2 nearby islands, and he completed it without once reaching for a single written note. He never did find a single map to memorize. He found instead 1,000 small signs, each one trusted in its own moment, that eventually carried him, like water finding the lowest ground, exactly where he needed to go. Years afterward, when he himself began teaching apprentices of his own, he found himself repeating the navigator's old habit of sitting them down to watch the tide retreat, before ever mentioning a single star. In Polynesian wayfinding tradition, there is a similar understanding of trusting the present moment over a fixed plan. Traditional navigators crossed vast stretches of open Pacific Ocean without instruments, reading wave patterns, star paths, cloud formations, and the behavior of seabirds to determine their position and direction. This practice, sometimes called wave piloting, depends entirely on remaining attentive to what the ocean is communicating right now, rather than following a predetermined route drawn in advance. There is also the Polynesian concept of etak, a way of tracking progress not by distance traveled, but by the changing relationship between the canoe and a reference island over the horizon. Rather than measuring how far they had come, navigators measured how their position related to what mattered, continuously adjusting as conditions shifted beneath them. A navigator using etak might never know the exact distance covered in a day, yet still know, with complete confidence, precisely where the canoe stood relative to its destination. Both practices mirror what the navigator showed her apprentice. Wave piloting and etak both ask a traveler to release the need for a fixed map, trusting instead in continuous attentiveness, the same way water reads the tilt of land moment to moment, rather than memorizing the route to the sea in advance. In Polynesian tradition, as in the wisdom of the swell, arrival was never about the plan. It was about the noticing sharpened across a lifetime until the ocean itself seemed to speak directly to the body holding the paddle. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, gripping tightly to a 5-year plan while ignoring the small present signs that your actual path has already begun shifting beneath you. Think about a career decision you delayed for months, waiting for a perfect, fully mapped plan, when a series of small, attentive choices might have carried you there gently instead. You may have felt this in a relationship, waiting for a single grand conversation to resolve everything, when the real understanding came through dozens of small, quiet moments of noticing each other. Or think of a creative project that only found its shape once you stopped demanding a finished outline and simply followed each small, honest next step. This shows up in ordinary life when you treat uncertainty as a failure to plan well enough. When you forget that some of the wisest decisions are made one attentive moment at a time. It might also appear as refusing to start a project until every step is mapped, when starting with the first true sign in front of you would have moved things further along already. Right now, in this breath, you do not need a map for tonight. Feel what it is like to simply notice this moment, the gentle tilt toward rest, the way a navigator notices the tilt of a swell. Let that same attentiveness carry you, unhurried, into sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu wrote that the way is like an uncarved block, simple and whole before it is shaped into 1,000 separate purposes. He believed something essential is lost each time we force the world into smaller, fixed categories. The way a river loses something of its wholeness once it is dammed into separate named pools. Taoists call this the uncarved block, pu, a reminder that the simplest, least divided state often holds the most potential. A river does not need a name at every bend to know where it is going. It only needs to remain connected to itself. Start to see one continuous flowing whole. The uncarved block holds every possible shape precisely because it has not yet been forced into only one of them. In a dry red landscape crossed by ancient walking paths, there lived an elder who knew every waterhole between the mountains and the coast, though no map existed of any of them. Only the songs her own grandmother had once sung to her along this very route. A young man from a distant settlement came to her, troubled and thinner than when he had left, after losing his way during a long crossing. I carried careful notes, he said. Distances, directions, the names of every landmark I was told to expect. And still I became lost between two waterholes that should have been only a day apart. The elder, sitting beside a small spring shaded by river gums, smiled and gestured for him to sit. She settled into the shade of the river gum, gesturing for him to do the same. "Tell me your notes," she said. He read them aloud. Careful measurements, compass directions, lists of plants expected at each stage of the journey. "And did you sing as you walked?" she asked when he finished. "Sing? No, I do not know any songs about this land." "That," she said, "is why you became lost." The young man frowned. "I do not understand. A song is not a map." "No," she said. "A song is something better than a map. The paths across this country were never written down as separate lines between separate points. They were sung, start to end, as one continuous story, each waterhole connected to the last, not by distance alone, but by what happened there. What creature shaped that rock? What ancestor rested beneath that tree? The song does not divide the land into 100 unrelated facts. It holds the whole journey as one single living thing. How can a melody hold information the way a written list can? The young man asked. A list can be checked. A song simply ends when it ends. A list can also be lost in a single gust of wind, the elder said, or burned, or forgotten in a satchel left behind at the wrong camp. A song lives inside the body that carries it. It cannot be misplaced the way a scrap of paper can. And because each part connects to the part before it, forgetting one piece rarely loses you the whole, the way losing one written line can erase everything that depended on it. She paused beside the spring, listening to a bird call somewhere in the scrub. There is also this, she added. A list tells you only where to go. A song tells you why the place matters, who came before you, what you owe the land in return for its water. Your written notes told you distances. They never once told you to thank the waterhole for receiving you. But surely facts matter, the young man said. Distance, direction, these are not nothing. They are not nothing, she agreed. But tell me, when you forgot the exact number of paces between two waterholes, what did you have left to guide you? Nothing, he admitted, only scattered facts with the connections between them missing. This is the trouble with carving the world into separate pieces, she said. Each piece alone is brittle. Forget one fact and the whole structure collapses. But a song does not break the same way. Even if you forget one verse, the melody itself still pulls you toward the next. The way a river still finds the sea, even when a single bend is hidden in fog. "Will you teach me the song for this crossing?" the young man asked. She rose slowly, brushing red dust from her knees, and looked toward the distant blue line where the land would eventually meet the sea. "I will sing it with you, once from here to the coast," she said. "But understand, I'm not handing you a list to memorize. I'm inviting you to feel the whole land as one continuous body, the way your own blood does not stop existing between your heart and your hand. It is all one flowing thing, whether or not you have given each stretch of it a separate name. They walked together for many days, the elder singing low as they crossed each rise and waterhole, weaving names, stories, and directions into a single unbroken thread. At each waterhole she paused to tell him not only how to find it again, but why it mattered. The ancestor who had rested there, the creature whose tracks still marked the soft red clay nearby, the particular plant that told a traveller the water was still good to drink. By the time they reached the coast, the young man found he did not need to recall a single isolated fact. He simply remembered the song, and the song, like water remembering its own course, carried the entire journey inside it. Years later, when he led his own crossing for the first time, guiding 3 younger travelers who trusted him the way he had once trusted the elder, he did not bring careful written notes. He brought only the song, sung the whole way through, the country unfolding before him exactly as it always had, whole and continuous, never carved apart at all. When one of the younger travellers asked him to write the route down so it would not be forgotten, he only shook his head and began instead to teach them the melody. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, there is a similar understanding of wholeness over fragmentation. Songlines, sometimes called dreaming tracks, encode vast distances of geography, navigation, and ancestral story into a single continuous song, passed down across countless generations. Rather than treating land as a series of separate, named locations, songlines hold the entire journey as one living, unbroken narrative. There is also the broader concept, often translated as the dreaming, which describes a timeless, ongoing creation that connects land, ancestry, and present life into a single, continuous reality, rather than a sequence of disconnected past events. Nothing in this worldview is treated as finished or separate. Everything remains part of the same ongoing, unbroken whole, with the past continuing to move through the present the way an old river continues moving through ground it shaped long ago. Both teachings mirror what the elder offered the young traveller. Songlines and the dreaming both resist the impulse to carve the world into isolated, brittle facts, the same way the uncarved block resists being reduced to a single narrow purpose. In Aboriginal tradition, as in the wisdom of the unbroken song, the whole is sturdier and somehow easier to remember than any of its separated parts, carried forward across generations precisely because it was never broken apart in the first place. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, breaking a difficult feeling into so many separate analyzed pieces that you lose the simple whole sense of what you actually need. Think about a time you tried to solve a worry by listing every possible outcome separately, only to feel more scattered, not less. You may have felt this with a memory, picking apart a single moment from your past into so many small judgments that you forgot the simple whole feeling the memory once held. Or think of a piece of music you once loved purely before you learned to analyze its structure, and how something in the wholeness of it changed once you began naming all of its separate parts. This shows up in ordinary life when you treat your evening as a list of separate, unconnected tasks to finish, rather than one continuous unwinding from day into rest. You might also notice it in how you recall a vacation as a checklist of sights seen, rather than as one flowing memory of light, company, and unhurried time. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to carve tonight into separate pieces. Feel this evening as one continuous, unbroken thread, the way a songline carries a whole journey inside a single melody. Let that same wholeness carry you gently into sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that all things return eventually to their root, the way rain falls, gathers, and eventually rises again as mist to become rain once more. He did not see this returning as an ending. He saw it as the way the world renews itself, endlessly, without ever truly stopping. Taoists call this the returning, a quiet cycling back that is not decline, but renewal. Water does not disappear when it evaporates from the sea. It simply changes shape for a while, gathers itself in the sky, and falls again somewhere new, carrying the same essential nature it has always carried. What looks from where we stand like loss is often only water taking the long way back to us. In a land of dense jungle and stepped stone temples, there lived a priest who studied the long counting of days, tracking how seasons folded into other seasons across generations, his records kept on bark paper stacked floor to ceiling in a cool stone chamber. A young farmer came to him after a year of terrible drought. His maize fields cracked and bare, the soil split into pale plates that crumbled underfoot. "Everything I planted has died," the farmer said. "I fear the rains have abandoned us forever. Tell me how to make peace with an ending." The priest, who spent his mornings recording the movement of stars and the slow march of seasons, smiled and led the farmer to a stone basin near the temple, half filled with still water reflecting the sky. "Watch the surface of this water," the priest said, settling onto a low stone bench worn smooth by generations of patient watchers before him, "until midday." The farmer waited, restless at first, watching the water grow warm beneath the climbing sun. Slowly, he noticed faint wisps of vapor curling upward from the basin's surface. "It is disappearing," the farmer said, alarmed. "Even this water is leaving us now." "Is it leaving?" the priest asked, "or is it returning?" The farmer frowned. "I do not understand the difference. Either way, the basin grows emptier." "Watch a leaf fall from a tree in autumn," the priest said. "Is the tree losing the leaf forever, or is the leaf simply returning to the soil that will feed the same tree's roots again next spring?" "I suppose it returns," the farmer said, "but a leaf is patient. It does not need to eat. My family does." "This is fair," the priest said, nodding slowly. "Patience asked of a hungry man is a harder patience than patience asked of a leaf. I do not ask you to feel nothing while you wait. I only ask you to notice that your fear, however real, has never once changed the timing of a single storm in all the generations my order has recorded." The priest let the question hang a moment, watching the temple's stone steps fade into shadow as the afternoon wore on. "Tell me," he said, "where does rain come from before it ever falls?" "From clouds," the farmer said. The priest nodded, watching a faint white wisp rise from the basin and vanish into the brighter sky above the temple steps. "And where do the clouds come from?" The farmer considered this, watching the thin vapor rise. "From water like this, I suppose, risen from rivers, lakes, the sea." "So this water, leaving the basin right now," the priest said, "is not vanishing into nothing. It is returning to where rain begins. It will gather above us in its own time, the way it always has, and one day it will fall again as the very drought-breaking storm you are praying for." "But how long must we wait?" the farmer asked. "My family cannot eat the promise of future rain." The priest was quiet for a while, watching the vapor thin and disappear into the bright sky. "There is a long counting kept by my order," he said, "tracking droughts and floods across more lifetimes than either of us could name. Every drought we have recorded eventually ended. Every flood eventually receded. The pattern always returns to its root, though never in exactly the same way twice." "That is not the same as knowing when," the farmer said, frustrated. "No," the priest agreed, "and I will not pretend to know the day the rains return. But tell me, does despair plant a single seed faster? Does grief shorten a drought by even one day?" "No," the farmer admitted. "Then perhaps the question is not when the water returns," the priest said, "but how you choose to wait for it. The water in this basin does not panic as it rises into mist. It simply trusts the larger cycle it has always belonged to, the same cycle that carried it here as rain in the first place." The farmer sat with the priest through the long, dry afternoon, watching the basin's water continue its slow, invisible rise into the sky. Cicadas droning steadily in the jungle beyond the temple walls. He returned to his cracked fields that evening with no new certainty about the date of the next storm. But something in him had loosened, the same way the water had loosened from the basin, trusting a return it could not yet see. He spent the following weeks repairing tools, clearing dead stalks, preparing the soil for planting, even before a single cloud appeared on the horizon, working with a steadiness that no longer came from desperation. His neighbors thought him strange for tending a field that showed no sign of rain. He told them only that the water in the temple basin had taught him to trust a cycle larger than his own impatience. The rains did come eventually, as they always had before, arriving first as a single grey afternoon, and then, within a week, as the steady downpour the whole village had been praying for. The farmer planted again, and the maize grew tall and green within the month, and in the years that followed, whenever drought returned, he remembered the rising vapor above the temple basin, and waited a little more like water, and a little less like a man bracing against an ending that had never actually been one. In Mayan cosmology, there is a similar understanding of cyclical renewal rather than linear ending. The Mayan calendar systems, including the long count, were built around the belief that time moves in great repeating cycles rather than a single straight line toward a final conclusion. Droughts, harvests, and even the rise and fall of cities were understood as part of larger turning wheels of time, each ending folding naturally into a new beginning. There is also the Mayan reverence for cenotes, sacred water-filled sinkholes considered portals between the visible world and the underworld. Rainwater that disappeared into the earth through a cenote was not believed to be lost. It was understood to travel through a hidden, sacred cycle, eventually returning to nourish the land again from some unseen source. Pilgrims sometimes traveled great distances simply to sit at the edge of a cenote during drought, trusting that the water's apparent disappearance underground was itself part of its eventual return. Both beliefs mirror what the priest showed the farmer beside his basin. The long count and the cenote both insist that apparent disappearance is rarely a true ending, the same way mist rising from still water is simply rain pausing on its way back to the sky. In Mayan tradition, as in the wisdom of the returning, every drought eventually folds back into rain. Every fallen city eventually rises again in some new form, and every ending observed closely enough reveals itself as a beginning still in disguise. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, mistaking a difficult season for a permanent ending rather than one turn in a longer cycle. Think about a period of grief you once believed would never lighten, which eventually did soften slowly, the way drought eventually softens into rain. You may have felt this after a loss of energy or motivation, certain it would last forever, only to notice it return quietly weeks or months later. Or think of a friendship that went quiet for a season, which found its way back to warmth once both of you stopped forcing it and simply let time do its slow, patient work. This shows up in ordinary life when you treat a hard week as proof that ease is gone for good. When you forget that even the driest seasons in your life have always, eventually, folded back toward renewal. It might also appear after a string of bad days, when you catch yourself assuming tomorrow will simply repeat them, rather than allowing for the cycle to turn. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to fear that this tiredness is permanent. Feel what it is like to trust the larger cycle you belong to, the way water trusts its slow rise back toward rain. Let that same trust carry you gently into sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel. Just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the gentlest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world, and that nothing in existence is more yielding than water, and yet nothing surpasses it for attacking what is hard and unyielding. He did not believe gentleness was the opposite of strength. He believed gentleness was strength's truest and most enduring form. Taoists call this the soft overcoming the hard, repeated now across many chapters because it sits so close to the center of everything Lao Tzu tried to teach. Ice does not need force to become water again. It only needs warmth, patience, and time. The same three things that quietly undo almost everything that calls itself unbreakable. This is the teaching we have circled all 13 chapters, returning to it once more here at the close, because some truths are worth hearing again in a different season of the same long night. In a northern land of long winters, there lived a wise woman who tended a frozen lake each year as it slowly thawed each spring, watching for the first dark cracks that meant the ice was finally letting go. A young warrior came to her one cold morning, his shield strapped tight across his back, his breath sharp in the freezing air, his expression hard as the ice beneath his boots. "I have come from a hall where every man boasts of his strength," he said. "I want to be the strongest among them. Tell me how to become like the frost giants of old, unbreakable and feared." The wise woman, who was kneeling at the lake's edge, breaking a thin layer of new ice with her bare palm, smiled and beckoned him closer. She rose and walked closer to the lake's edge, her bare feet unbothered by the cold ground. "Tell me what you see," she said, gesturing toward the lake. The warrior studied the pale grey surface stretching out before them, scuffed in places where children had skated the week before. "Ice," he said, "solid enough to walk across." She broke another thin sheet of ice and let it slide back beneath the surface. "And in 3 months, what would you see?" He thought of his own training, the hours spent striking frozen ground until his joints ached. "Water," he admitted. "It always melts eventually." "And in 3 months after that?" she asked. "Once the warmth fades and the nights grow long again?" "Ice again," he said, "when winter returns." "So which is the truer nature of this lake?" she asked. "The ice or the water?" The warrior considered this. "I suppose neither exactly. It is always becoming the other." She watched the dark current beneath the thinning ice a moment, as if listening for something only she could hear. "Yes," she said. "And tell me, when the ice finally breaks apart each spring, is it broken by a greater force striking it from outside, by some giant's hammer or a warrior's axe?" "No," he said. "It simply melts. The sun warms it, and it lets go of its hardness on its own." "Now tell me about your hall of boasting men," she said. "Which one among them do you believe will still be standing in spirit when an old age or a grief or a long illness finally comes for him the way spring comes for ice?" The warrior frowned. "The strongest, surely. The one who never bent for anyone." "Will he?" she asked. "Or will the one who never learned to bend simply shatter all at once, the way ice shatters when struck rather than warmed, when the moment finally arrives that even he cannot stand rigid against?" The warrior was quiet for a long moment, watching her palm rest against the thin ice at the lake's edge. "I do not want to shatter," he said finally, "but I also do not want to be thought weak." "Tell me which costs more," the wise woman said. "A season of being misunderstood by men who boast loudest in the hall, or a lifetime of brittleness that finally breaks you at the one moment you cannot afford to break? I have buried many hard men in my years tending this lake. I have buried far fewer who learned to bend." The warrior looked out at the lake, half frozen, half open where the current beneath still moved. "How does a man even begin learning to bend," he asked, "after a lifetime of being taught only to harden?" "Slowly," she said. "The ice on this lake does not become water all at once either. It softens first at the edges, where the sun reaches longest, long before the center ever lets go. Begin at your own edges. Let one small, rigid belief soften before you ask the center of yourself to change at all. She drew her cloak tighter against a gust off the water, unbothered by the cold, the way only someone who has spent decades beside this particular lake could be. "Tell me," she said, "is this lake weak because it yields each spring, or is it simply continuing to exist, season after season, longer than any single block of ice that refuses to change at all?" "It continues," he said slowly, "long after the ice that thinks itself permanent has melted and reformed 100 times over. There is an old story among our people," the wise woman said, "of the world tree, whose roots reach into the deepest well of fate, and whose branches are nourished by water carried up from that well each day. Even the tree that holds the world together depends on water that bends, flows, and returns, never on a single rigid, unchanging substance. Strength in this land has never meant refusing to change. It has meant enduring through every change, the way this lake endures through ice and water both, never breaking, only becoming." The warrior returned to his hall that season and said little about strength for a long while. He still trained, still carried his shield, still stood firm when standing firm served him well. But he also began, in small ways the other men noticed and did not entirely understand, to soften where softening cost him nothing. Sitting with a grieving widow instead of avoiding her discomfort, admitting an error in front of younger warriors instead of defending it, resting when his body asked for rest instead of training through injury to prove a point no one had actually challenged. The other men in the hall mocked him at first, calling him soft, the very word he had once feared most. He found he no longer minded the word as much as he once had. He had also learned, from a frozen lake and a woman unafraid of cold water, that the men who bent without breaking, who let warmth soften them when warmth came, were the ones still standing generations later, long after the proudest, hardest ice in the hall had cracked and melted away, their boasts buried with them. In Norse mythology, there is a similar understanding of enduring strength through change rather than rigidity. The world tree, Yggdrasil, is nourished by water drawn daily from the well of Erd, sacred waters tied to fate itself. Even the structure said to hold the 9 realms together depends entirely on something fluid, something carried and renewed rather than fixed and frozen in place. There is also the Norse concept of the Norns, the 3 beings who tend the well and shape the threads of fate, often depicted watering the tree's roots to keep it from withering. Their work was never a single finished act. It was continuous tending, day after day, much like water continuously renewing whatever it touches, rather than fixing it permanently in one unchanging form. Without their daily care, the old stories warn even Yggdrasil's mighty trunk would begin to wither, proof that no strength, however ancient, survives entirely on its own hardness. Both images mirror what the wise woman showed the young warrior beside her thawing lake. Yggdrasil and the Well of Erd both suggest that even the mightiest, most enduring structures depend on something soft and ever-moving at their root. In Norse tradition, as in the wisdom of the frozen lake, true endurance was never the refusal to change. It was the willingness to be nourished, again and again, by whatever softens us enough to keep standing, season after long, cold season, until even the hardest winter finally remembers how to become spring. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, believing that appearing unaffected, unshaken and hard is the only respectable way to face difficulty. Think about a time you refused to let anyone see you struggling after a loss, holding your face rigid through a hard week, when allowing a little softness might have let people actually help you. You may have felt this in your own body, gripping your jaw through a stressful day, holding tension like ice that refuses on principle to melt. Or think of a moment you finally let a friend see you cry, expecting judgment, and instead found the relationship deepened rather than weakened by what you had shown them. This shows up in ordinary life when you mistake softening for failure, when you forget that even the world's oldest myths describe ultimate strength as something nourished by water, never by an unyielding, unchanging hardness. A second version might be insisting you do not need help moving a heavy box or carrying a hard week alone, when accepting an offered hand would have cost you nothing but pride. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to hold your hardness any longer. Feel what it is like to let warmth move through you, the way ice finally lets go of its shape each spring. Let that same gentle melting carry you all the way into sleep tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with the nature of water as Lao Tzu's central teaching on strength. And over these 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We sat with a boatwright teaching a carpenter to hold a bull without spilling it. We watched a riverkeeper show a fisherman that the quiet channel reaches the sea while the loud one only churns against the same stone. We knelt beside a stream with a soldier learning that a smooth, water-worn rock had once been jagged. We visited a garden pond that gathered every spring simply by remaining low. We sat with a scholar beside a well, learning that emptiness has its own quiet usefulness. We watched a flooded field recede in its own time. Once a farmer finally set his shovel down. We pressed our palms against a temple pond and felt it grow calm again the moment we stopped disturbing it. We walked down from a hilltop with a chieftain's daughter to where rivers actually meet the sea. We stood beside a shared spring with two neighbors who learned their herds had never truly been separate. We crossed open ocean with a navigator who read the swell instead of a map. We followed a songline across red, dry country, one unbroken melody instead of 100 scattered facts. We watched mist rise from a temple basin during a long drought, trusting an ending that was never really an ending at all. And we knelt at a thawing lake with a warrior learning that even the mightiest tree is nourished by water, never by ice. We are not the stone gate, refusing every storm until the day we finally crack. We are not the churning rapids, loud and exhausted, making no progress at all. We are not the ice that mistakes its hardness for its only worth. We are the water that nourishes without needing thanks. We are the current that finds the open channel instead of fighting the rock. We are the lowest place that somehow gathers everything. We are the mist that rises, trusting its own quiet return. True strength does not look like force. It looks like water, soft, yielding, patient, and yet capable, given enough time, of shaping mountains. When we stop trying to be hard and unbreakable, and instead become adaptable like water, we find a strength that struggle alone could never have given us. This is not a teaching mastered once and then carried forever after, finished and certain. It is a teaching we return to again and again, the way water returns to the sea and rises and falls as rain, and returns once more. Some nights you will remember it easily. Other nights you will need to be reminded gently, the way this chapter has tried to remind you tonight. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down tonight, gently, the way water sets down its long journey at the edge of the sea. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at night.